What drives a man to commit murder? And what happens when guilt begins to consume him? Crime and Punishment, one of Fyodor Dostoevsky's greatest novels, is a psychological and philosophical masterpiece. It follows Rodion Raskolnikov, a poor former student in St. Petersburg, who believes he is intellectually superior to others and commits murder to test his theory of power and morality. But what follows is not triumph. It is paranoia, guilt, and an unrelenting psychological descent. Dostoevsky's novel explores themes of crime, justice, redemption, and the weight of conscience. It challenges the idea of morality and asks whether a person can truly escape punishment, not from the law, but from their own mind. Let's dive into Crime and Punishment and follow Raskolnikov's fateful journey. Chapter 1. The Plan for Murder. Rodion Raskolnikov walks the streets of St. Petersburg. Petersburg, lost in thought. He is penniless, living in a tiny, filthy apartment, tormented by hunger and feverish ideas. Society has abandoned him, and in return, he has abandoned society. But he has a plan. In his mind, the world is divided into ordinary people who live and obey, and extraordinary people who have the right to break laws to achieve greatness. Napoleon, Caesar. These men did not follow rules. They shaped the world. Raskolnikov believes he is one of them. He has chosen his target, Alyona Ivanovna, a cruel and greedy pawnbroker. She preys on the poor, taking their last possessions for a few kopecks. Killing her, he reasons, would not be a crime. It would be a service to society, a single death for the greater good. But even as he convinces himself, doubt lingers. Raskolnikov visits the pawnbroker under the pretense of pawning a watch. He studies her apartment, the layout, the locks, the escape route. He notices her frail sister, Lizaveta, a meek woman who suffers under Alyona's cruelty. As he leaves, his heart pounds. This is no longer just a theory. It is a plan. Yet, fear grips him. Is he truly capable of murder? Or is he just another desperate man clinging to a dangerous idea? The streets of St. Petersburg seem to close in on him, suffocating, whispering. The weight of his decision looms. Tomorrow he will decide. Tomorrow he will kill. Chapter 2. Fever and Doubt. Raskolnikov wakes up in his tiny, stifling apartment, drenched in sweat. The fever that has haunted him for days seems worse. His thoughts are disorganized, his mind clouded by hunger and exhaustion. The plan to murder Alyona Ivanovna lingers in his head. But now, in the haze of morning, doubt creeps in. He feels weak, sickly, hardly the image of a man capable of reshaping the world through an act of calculated violence. He steps outside into the suffocating summer heat of St. Petersburg. The streets are crowded, restless, alive with noise. He drifts through them, feeling both disconnected and strangely exhilarated. He finds himself at a tavern, where he meets Marmeladov, a drunken former government clerk. Marmeladov tells Raskolnikov about his family, his suffering wife, Katerina Ivanovna, and his daughter Sonia, who has been forced into prostitution to support them. The encounter unsettles Raskolnikov. Here is real suffering, real injustice. And yet, what does it matter? His own thoughts are far more pressing. Later, he receives a letter from his mother. She tells him that his sister, Dunya, is engaged to Luzhin, a pompous, self-serving man. Raskolnikov is disgusted. He sees the engagement as a financial sacrifice Dunya is making for the family's survival. The thought fills him with anger. Why should people like Luzhin and Alyona Ivanovna have power over others? The fever returns. His head throbs. Everything feels unbearable. That night, he dreams of a childhood memory. A group of men savagely beating an old horse to death, while a young Raskolnikov watches in horror. The dream shakes him to his core. Is this what he has become? A man preparing to kill, to justify cruelty in the name of power? But when he wakes up, the doubt is gone. He knows what he must do. Tomorrow he will commit the crime. Chapter 3. The Murder. The day arrives. Raskolnikov is numb, detached, focused. Every detail of his plan has been rehearsed in his mind. There is no room for hesitation. He hides an axe beneath his coat and sets out for Alyona Ivanovna's apartment. The streets of St. Petersburg blur around him, the summer heat pressing in. Every sound feels amplified, the distant cries of vendors, the chatter of pedestrians, the rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat. At the pawnbroker's door, he knocks. Alyona answers, eyeing him suspiciously. He steps inside, his breath steady, his movements precise. He will do what must be done. As she turns her back, he raises the axe and strikes. The blow lands with sickening force. Alyona collapses instantly. Blood seeps into the wooden floorboards. The room is silent, except for the pounding in Raskolnikov's head. It is done. But then, a sound. The door opens. Lizaveta, Alyona's meek sister, stands frozen in the doorway. Her eyes widen in horror. She has seen everything. For a moment, Raskolnikov hesitates. Lizaveta is innocent. She has done nothing wrong, but she is a witness. Without thinking, he swings the axe again. Lizaveta crumples beside her sister. The weight of what he has done crashes over him. There is no turning back. The escape. Raskolnikov scrambles to ransack the apartment, searching for valuables to make the murder appear like a robbery. His hands tremble. His vision blurs. Suddenly, footsteps in the hallway. A visitor knocking. Panic sets in. He freezes, waiting, listening. After a tense moment, the visitor leaves. He seizes the opportunity and flees, disappearing into the crowded streets. His heart races. His mind spins. He has done it. But instead of feeling victorious, he feels nothing. And as he returns to his apartment, drenched in sweat and shaking, he realizes that the true punishment has just begun. Chapter 4. The Fever of Guilt. Back in his tiny apartment, Raskolnikov collapses onto his bed. His body is exhausted, but his mind is in turmoil. The weight of what he has done presses on him, yet he cannot bring himself to think about it. He has killed, but what does it mean? His fever worsens. He drifts in and out of sleep, his thoughts a tangled mess of images. Alyona's bloodied body, Lizaveta's wide, terrified eyes, the weight of the axe in his hands. His dreams offer no escape, only a restless swirl of fear and delirium. Days pass in a blur. He is barely conscious, barely eating. His friend Razumikin, noticing his absence, comes to check on him. Razumikin is worried. Raskolnikov looks like a ghost, his skin clammy, his movements sluggish. But Raskolnikov offers no explanations, no reassurances. He can barely speak. A knock at the door. Then a sudden knock. The police. Not for the murder, but for an unrelated debt. The officers summon Raskolnikov to the station for questioning about money he owes. The irony of the situation is almost laughable. He is a murderer, yet the law only pursues him for something so trivial. At the police station, Raskolnikov can barely focus. The heat, the noise, the voices around him blur together. Then, he hears something that makes his blood run cold. A conversation about the murder. The officers are discussing Alyona Ivanovna's death. They speculate about who could have committed such a crime. Raskolnikov sways on his feet. His head spins. His breath catches. They don't suspect him, but his nerves betray him. He suddenly faints. When he wakes, the officers are watching him closely. Why did he react so strongly? But they let him go for now. Raskolnikov stumbles out of the station, gasping for air. His mind races. Has he already given himself away? The fever inside him rages on. The city around him feels suffocating, its streets closing in like the walls of a prison. The real punishment has begun. Chapter 5. A Mind Unraveling. Raskolnikov's fever refuses to break. He spends the following days drifting between wakefulness and delirium, unable to distinguish reality from his fevered dreams. His mind replays the murder again and again, each detail sharper, each moment more unbearable. Razumikin stays by his side, trying to nurse him back to health. But Raskolnikov pushes him away. The presence of others suffocates him. He feels like a man caught in a trap, one he set for himself. A visit from his mother and sister. Just as he begins to recover, another shock arrives. His mother and sister, Dunya, have come to St. Petersburg. His mother is relieved to see him, but immediately senses something is wrong. Raskolnikov, once ambitious and full of ideas, now seems like a man haunted. His eyes dart nervously. His speech is erratic. Dunya, strong-willed and practical, is even more concerned. She has always seen through Raskolnikov's arrogance and pride. She knows he is hiding something. To Raskolnikov, their presence is unbearable. He cannot stand their love, their concern. It feels like another layer of guilt pressing down on him. The appearance of Porfiry Petrovitch. Raskolnikov soon finds himself in a conversation with Porfiry Petrovitch, the magistrate investigating the murder. Porfiry is intelligent, methodical, and perceptive. He enjoys psychological games. He does not accuse Raskolnikov outright. Instead, he speaks in riddles, planting doubt, making Raskolnikov squirm under invisible pressure. "Tell me," Porfiry says casually, "do you believe that extraordinary men have the right to commit crimes for the greater good?" Raskolnikov's blood turns to ice. It is as if Porfiry can see into his soul. Though Porfiry remains polite, the underlying message is clear. I know what you did. The descent into paranoia. As Raskolnikov leaves the conversation, his paranoia deepens. Is Porfiry simply toying with him? Or does he already have proof? Every glance from a stranger feels like suspicion. Every footstep behind him sounds like an officer following his trail. The city itself becomes an extension of his growing madness. He's no longer in control. The crime was meant to prove his superiority, but instead, it has reduced him to a fearful, broken man. And the walls are closing in. Chapter 6. Confessions and Conflicts. Raskolnikov's paranoia tightens its grip. He feels the walls closing in, the city itself pressing against him. The murder was meant to prove his superiority, but instead, it has turned him into a hunted man, even if no one has accused him yet. A confession without confessing. Desperate for some form of release, he visits Sonya Marmeladov, the fragile but kind-hearted young woman forced into prostitution to support her family. There is something about Sonya's quiet suffering that draws him in. She has endured hardship without bitterness, without resorting to cruelty. He watches her closely. Does she suspect him? Could she understand what he has done? Without thinking, he begins talking about crime, about guilt, about the idea of extraordinary men being above morality. Sonya listens, her eyes wide with worry. She does not judge, but she sees his torment. And for the first time, Raskolnikov wonders, what if he is not extraordinary at all? What if he is just another broken man? Porfiry tightens the noose. The next day, Raskolnikov is summoned to see Porfiry Petrovitch again. But this time, the game has changed. Porfiry is no longer hinting. He is circling. He tells Raskolnikov about how criminals always give themselves away, how guilt manifests in strange behaviors, in contradictions, in unnecessary visits to the crime scene. Raskolnikov tries to stay calm, but his pulse races. Every sentence from Porfiry feels like a trap. Then, a final blow. Porfiry laughs softly and says, "A guilty man will often come to confess, not because he is caught, but because he can no longer bear his own mind." Raskolnikov stumbles out of the office, drenched in sweat. Porfiry still has no proof, but he knows. The breaking point. Back in his apartment, Raskolnikov cannot escape the weight of his crime. His mother's love feels suffocating. Dunya's concern burns like an accusation. Sonia's compassion is unbearable. And then, a final shock. Another man has falsely confessed to the murder. Raskolnikov should feel relieved. The crime has been pinned on someone else. He is free. But he is not. Instead, the lie crushes him. He wanted to prove he was beyond morality. But here he is. Haunted, suffering, breaking. He must make a choice. To continue down this path of fear and madness, or to finally face his crime. Chapter 7. The Confession. The weight of guilt becomes unbearable. Raskolnikov can no longer walk the streets without feeling the eyes of the city upon him. Every glance feels like an accusation. Every shadow whispers his crime. He is trapped, not by the law, but by his own mind. A final visit to Sonia. With his soul in turmoil, he returns to Sonia, the only person who seems to understand his suffering. He sits across from her, silent at first. Then he speaks. "I killed her," he confesses, his voice hollow. Sonia gasps, but there is no condemnation in her eyes, only sorrow. She clasps her hands together, trembling, but she does not turn away. "You must repent," she whispers. "You must accept your suffering." She tells him to go to the square, to kneel in public, and to confess before all. Only then can he begin to atone. The public confession. Raskolnikov, exhausted and broken, stumbles into the square. The crowd moves around him, indifferent. He stands for a moment, staring at the people. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, untouched by his theories of power. Slowly, he falls to his knees. The world does not stop. No one notices at first. But then, a few turn, whispering. A man kneeling in the street, trembling, whispering words of confession. "I am guilty," he murmurs. At that moment, Porfiry's men step forward. The law has finally caught up with him. But in truth, Raskolnikov has already sentenced himself. The road to Siberia. He is arrested. The trial is swift. There is no real defense. He is sentenced to 8 years in Siberia. As the prison doors close behind him, he feels a strange sense of relief. The running is over. The suffering has only begun. But perhaps, in suffering, there is redemption. Final thoughts. Crime and Punishment is not just a story about a murder. It is a story about guilt, justice, and redemption. Raskolnikov believed he could commit a crime without consequences, that he was above morality. But in the end, it was not the law that punished him. It was his own conscience. Dostoevsky shows us that true punishment is not just imprisonment. It is the torment of the human soul. And yet, there is hope. In Siberia, Raskolnikov begins to transform. Through suffering, he finds meaning. Through Sonia's love and faith, he glimpses a path to redemption. Perhaps, in the end, his punishment was also his salvation. Subscribe for more classic book summaries in just 40 minutes. Check out our other audiobooks and rediscover the most important stories ever written. The Mystery of the Milk. One of the first signs of trouble came when the animals noticed that the milk from the cows had disappeared. At first, they had assumed it would be shared equally, just like everything else. But when they asked, the pigs simply replied, "It is needed for the leadership." Likewise, when the apple harvest came, the pigs took all the apples for themselves, claiming that they needed extra nutrition because they were in charge of making the big decisions. "Surely you don't want Jones to come back?" Squealer, Napoleon's slick-talking assistant, reminded them. "We pigs work for your benefit. Our brains keep the farm running." The animals, though uneasy, did not argue. They had fought too hard for their freedom to risk losing it again. Divisions begin to form. As time went on, Snowball and Napoleon began to argue more and more. Snowball wanted to build a windmill to generate electricity for the farm, making life easier for everyone. Napoleon, however, dismissed the idea. "Hard work, not fantasies, will keep us strong," he declared. Snowball, with his intelligence and enthusiasm, quickly won over many of the animals. He gave passionate speeches, drew up blueprints, and explained how the windmill could transform their lives. But Napoleon was not interested in debate. He was interested in control. Then came the meeting that changed everything. As Snowball stood before the animals, explaining his final plans for the windmill, Napoleon stood up and let out a strange, sharp whistle. From the shadows, 9 enormous dogs charged into the crowd. They ran straight for Snowball, snarling and snapping. Snowball had only a moment to react before he was forced to flee for his life, running as fast as he could across the fields. He disappeared beyond the farm's borders, never to be seen again. The animals stood in shock. Where had the dogs come from? They realized that these were the puppies Napoleon had secretly raised in private, training them to be his personal enforcers. Snowball was gone, and Napoleon was now the undisputed ruler of Animal Farm. A new leader, a new era. Napoleon, now standing where Snowball had once been, looked at the gathered animals and declared, "The windmill was Snowball's foolish dream. It will not happen." From that day forward, meetings were abolished. Napoleon would make all decisions himself. The animals, though uneasy, had no choice but to accept his rule. Squealer, always ready with an explanation, assured them, "Comrades, Napoleon is only looking out for you. Do not worry. Everything he does is for the good of Animal Farm." But deep down, some of the animals could not help but feel that something had gone terribly wrong. The rebellion had started with dreams of equality. But now, one leader ruled them all. And it was only the beginning. Chapter 4. Spreading the Revolution. As weeks passed, Animal Farm settled into its new way of life. Napoleon's rule was firm, and the farm continued to function efficiently. But the dream of revolution did not end at the farm's borders. Napoleon and Squealer spread the idea of rebellion to other farms, encouraging animals elsewhere to rise up against their human masters. Pigeons were sent to neighboring farms to share the message of animalism, whispering of a new world where animals ruled themselves. Meanwhile, Mr. Jones, the former owner of Manor Farm, had not given up. Furious at being overthrown, he gathered a group of men from the nearby farms of Foxwood and Pinchfield to take back what he had lost. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Jones and his men returned with guns. They marched toward Animal Farm, ready to reclaim it by force. The animals had no time to prepare. The men stormed the fields, shooting as they advanced. The animals, though terrified, fought back with everything they had. Led by Snowball's pre-planned battle strategies, they charged at the men, using their hooves, horns, and claws. The horses kicked, the geese pecked, the cows rammed. Even the sheep, usually meek, swarmed and confused the enemy. Snowball himself led the charge, launching at Mr. Jones and knocking the gun from his hands. Jones fired a shot, wounding Snowball, but he refused to back down. After a brutal fight, the men were forced to flee. The animals had won. A hero is born, but quickly forgotten. The battle was later named the Battle of the Cowshed, and the animals celebrated their victory. Snowball was hailed as a hero, wounded but proud. He had led them to triumph. But Napoleon saw things differently. He watched as the animals cheered for Snowball, and he did not like it. The animals declared that a medal should be awarded to Snowball for his bravery, but Napoleon remained silent. He had already decided that Snowball's days were numbered. And soon enough, history would be rewritten in a way that would erase Snowball's victory entirely. Napoleon was patient. He knew that power was not just taken with force. It was controlled through fear, through manipulation, through changing the past to suit the present. And little by little, he was preparing for his next move. Chapter 5. The Rise of Napoleon. The winds of change swept across Animal Farm. Snowball was gone, driven out by Napoleon's ruthless dogs, and with his departure, any sense of debate or democracy vanished. Napoleon was now the supreme leader of the farm, and his rule was absolute. The windmill returns. Ironically, just days after declaring Snowball's plans for a windmill foolish, Napoleon announced that they would, in fact, build it. The windmill, he claimed, had always been his idea. Squealer, ever the loyal propagandist, reassured the animals. Comrades, Napoleon was merely pretending to oppose the windmill to get rid of the dangerous traitor Snowball. Now that Snowball is gone, we can build it the right way. Some of the animals, particularly Boxer the horse, accepted this explanation without question. Napoleon is always right, he repeated to himself. Others, though confused, were too afraid to argue. A new kind of rule. With his position secure, Napoleon made a series of changes. The Sunday meetings were abolished. No longer would animals gather to discuss farm policies. Instead, Napoleon would make all decisions, and they would be announced by Squealer. Even more unsettling, the animals noticed that Napoleon was rarely seen in public. He remained in the farmhouse, surrounded by his guards, the fierce dogs who had chased Snowball away. Napoleon also began using fear as a weapon. Every so often, Squealer would remind the animals, "Do you remember how hard life was under Jones? Surely you do not want him to return." The animals, though exhausted and overworked, convinced themselves that they were still better off than before. The rewriting of history. As time passed, strange things began to happen. The animals remembered that Snowball had fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed, that he had been injured protecting the farm. But now Squealer told them a different story. Snowball was a traitor, he declared. He was working with Jones from the beginning. Some animals hesitated. This was not how they remembered it. But as the weeks went by, Napoleon's version of history became the only accepted truth. The past was being rewritten before their eyes. Those who questioned it too much disappeared. Boxer's blind loyalty. Through it all, Boxer, the strongest and most hardworking of all the animals, remained utterly loyal to Napoleon. His personal motto, "I will work harder," became a kind of slogan for the farm. Whenever things got worse, whenever food rations were cut or rules changed, Boxer simply worked harder. Napoleon saw this and used it to his advantage. Napoleon's growing power. Life on the farm became harder, but Napoleon grew stronger. He was now never questioned. The animals were cold, hungry and exhausted. But Squealer assured them that things were improving. Do not trust your memory, comrades. Trust the numbers. We have increased production more than ever before. And when the animals looked at the figures he presented, they had no choice but to believe him. Napoleon had taken control of everything: the farm, the food, the truth. And for the first time, the animals realized that their dream of equality had turned into something else entirely: a dictatorship. But by the time they realized it, it was too late. Chapter 6. The Burdens of Leadership. The animals worked harder than ever before. Napoleon's rule was strict, and his demands were endless. The construction of the windmill had begun, and the labor was backbreaking. No machines, no tools, just muscle and determination. Boxer, as always, took the lead. "I will work harder," he repeated tirelessly, dragging massive stones day after day. His strength inspired the others, even as their bodies ached and their stomachs rumbled from constant hunger. Yet despite their efforts, life did not improve. Food rations were cut. Winter was brutal, and the farm was starving. The animals could not understand. Weren't they supposed to be better off than before? Napoleon's lies and justifications. Squealer, always ready with an explanation, assured them, "Comrades, we must make sacrifices. Our great leader Napoleon is making sure we survive. Do not listen to lies. Do not let doubt creep into your minds." The animals wanted to believe, but deep down, some of them felt something was wrong. Then came the most shocking news yet. Napoleon had decided to trade with humans, trading with the enemy. At the start of the revolution, it had been declared that animals would never engage in trade with humans. But now, Squealer explained, times had changed. Napoleon had struck a deal with the neighboring farms. They would sell eggs and grain in exchange for supplies. The hens, outraged at having their eggs taken, rebelled. They refused to give up their eggs, smashing them instead. Napoleon's response was swift and brutal. The dogs were sent in, and several hens were executed in front of the others. Fear spread. No one dared question Napoleon again. The collapse of the windmill. Despite the suffering, the windmill's construction continued. It became a symbol of progress, of animal farm strength. But then, on a stormy night, disaster struck. The windmill collapsed. The animals stood in shock, staring at the rubble. All their work, all their pain, gone. Napoleon, however, did not accept failure. "Snowball did this," he declared. "The traitor has returned to destroy what we built." The animals were horrified. Their hatred of Snowball, fueled by months of Squealer's lies, boiled over. Napoleon used this anger to tighten his grip further. The Purge. In the days that followed, Napoleon carried out his most terrifying act yet. One by one, animals were dragged before Napoleon's feet. Confessions were forced. Animals who were suspected of working with Snowball were executed on the spot. The killings continued until the ground was stained red with blood. Fear gripped the farm like never before. No one felt safe. The dream of freedom had turned into a nightmare of terror. And yet, despite it all, the animals kept working. They rebuilt the windmill. They accepted the hunger. They accepted the executions. Because in the back of their minds, they still believed. Somewhere, deep inside, they clung to the hope that this was all necessary, that Napoleon was their protector, that they were still working for something greater, even as the truth slipped further and further away. Chapter 7. The Harshest Winter. As the bitter cold of winter set in, Animal Farm fell into despair. The animals had never been so hungry, so exhausted, so afraid. The promised prosperity of their revolution had vanished, replaced by endless toil and silent suffering. The food supply was dwindling, and Napoleon knew that if the outside world discovered how badly things were going, it could threaten his control. He ordered Squealer to spread false reports to neighboring farms, boasting that Animal Farm was thriving. The starvation and lies. In reality, the animals were starving. Their rations were cut again and again, and they were forced to eat whatever they could find. Roots, straw, even sawdust mixed into their feed. To maintain his image of success, Napoleon tricked the outside world. He had the empty grain bins filled with sand, with a thin layer of real grain on top. When human visitors came, they saw the full storage and left believing the farm was prospering. The rebellion of the hens. But not everyone accepted Napoleon's rule without question. The hens were pushed to their limit when Napoleon announced that they must surrender even more eggs to trade for food. The hens, knowing this would mean starvation for their young, refused. In an act of defiance, they smashed their own eggs rather than hand them over. Napoleon responded swiftly and without mercy. The dogs were sent in, and the rebellious hens were brutally executed. The farm fell into an even deeper state of fear. No one spoke of rebellion again. Napoleon tightens his grip. As the months passed, Napoleon's control grew absolute. He stopped appearing in public, instead issuing orders through Squealer and the dogs. His every decision was law, and the animals no longer dared question his authority. He increased his personal comforts, moving into the farmhouse permanently, sleeping in a bed, drinking alcohol, all things that had once been forbidden. But Squealer always had an explanation. Our great leader, Napoleon, deserves the finest accommodations. He carries the burden of leadership for all of us. The animals, weak and overworked, simply nodded. They had no strength left to resist. Snowball, the eternal enemy. Even though Snowball was long gone, Napoleon used his name to maintain control. Any failure, any problem, any disaster was blamed on the invisible traitor. The storm destroyed the windmill? Snowball did it. The rations were low? Snowball sabotaged the food supply. An animal was caught speaking against Napoleon? Clearly a spy for Snowball. The animals lived in fear of an enemy who no longer existed. The executions continue. One evening, Napoleon gathered the animals and staged another purge. One by one, animals were dragged forward. Each was accused of being a traitor, a spy, a follower of Snowball. Under pressure and threats, some confessed to crimes they never committed. Each confession ended the same way. The dogs tore them apart. By the end of the night, a pile of bodies lay in the farmyard. Blood soaked the ground where once they had gathered in hope and unity. The remaining animals watched in horror, but no one spoke. No one dared. The rebellion had come full circle. The animals had overthrown one tyrant, only to create another. But now, they were too broken to resist. The fading of beasts of England. As the terror spread, something strange happened. The animals stopped singing Beasts of England. Once their anthem of freedom, it now reminded them of everything they had lost. Napoleon noticed this and officially banned the song. He replaced it with a new anthem, one that praised him personally. It was clear now. The revolution was dead, and Napoleon was the new Jones. Chapter 8. The Tyrant's Empire. By spring, Napoleon had transformed Animal Farm into his personal empire. He was no longer just a leader. He was a ruler. His image was everywhere, painted on the barn walls, glorified in songs, spoken about in hushed reverence. Squealer now referred to him as our leader, Comrade Napoleon. His name was always followed by elaborate praises. Napoleon, the wise, the just, the father of all animals. More lies, more fear. Napoleon's control over information became complete. The animals were told things had never been better. Squealer read out fake statistics about increased food production. He reminded the animals of their glorious victory against the traitor Snowball. The farm was stronger than ever, he claimed, and all was thanks to Napoleon's genius. Yet, the animals knew the truth. They were hungrier than ever, more afraid than ever. The secret deals with humans. Despite their original hatred for humans, Napoleon began negotiating with them. First, he sold timber to Mr. Frederick, a neighboring farmer. But soon after, Frederick betrayed them, paying with counterfeit money. Napoleon, furious, declared war, the Battle of the Windmill. Mr. Frederick and his men stormed Animal Farm, armed with guns and explosives. Their target? The windmill. The animals fought back bravely, but the men blew up the windmill, reducing it to rubble. The animals had won the battle, but at a terrible cost. Their symbol of progress was destroyed. More executions, more betrayal. Napoleon used the attack as an excuse for more executions. "Traitors among us," Squealer declared. More animals were dragged forward, accused of plotting against Napoleon. The dogs tore into them without hesitation. The farm of hypocrisy. The commandments were quietly altered to fit Napoleon's actions. No animal shall drink alcohol became, no animal shall drink alcohol to excess. No animal shall kill another animal, now read, no animal shall kill another animal, without cause. The animals could not remember when these changes had happened, but Squealer assured them the commandments had always been this way. The final illusion. Napoleon continued to host meetings with humans, walking on two legs, drinking with them, and treating them as equals. One day, the animals peered through the farmhouse window and saw Napoleon dining with the human farmers. They watched in horror. There was no longer a difference between the pigs and the humans. Their revolution was gone. Their dream of equality had been crushed. And they finally understood. Animal Farm had become exactly what they had fought to destroy. Chapter 9. The Betrayal of the Loyal. The hardships on Animal Farm grew worse with each passing season. The animals were older, weaker, and hungrier, but Napoleon's grip on power only strengthened. His commands were absolute, his rule unquestioned, and his propaganda machine, led by Squealer, worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of success. Boxer's last stand. No one worked harder than Boxer, the loyal cart horse. Even as his body grew frail and his legs trembled from exhaustion, he repeated his personal mantra, "I will work harder." The animals admired Boxer's strength and dedication, but they also worried about him. He was their strongest worker, but age had begun to slow him down. He dreamed of retiring someday, resting in the pasture he had been promised when he could no longer work. But Napoleon had other plans. One day, Boxer collapsed from overwork while hauling heavy stones for the windmill. The animals rushed to his side, desperate to help, but there was little they could do. Napoleon announced that Boxer would be taken to a veterinary hospital in town to receive proper care. The animals were relieved. Napoleon was finally showing compassion. Then came the day of Boxer's departure. A strange-looking cart arrived, and as the animals gathered to bid him farewell, Benjamin, the old donkey, read the words on the side of the cart. It did not say, "Veterinary Hospital." It said, "Horse Slaughterer." The animals screamed in horror as they realized the truth. Boxer was not being taken for treatment. He was being sent to his death. The strongest, most loyal worker of Animal Farm was being sold for profit. Boxer, too weak to fight back, could only look out at his comrades as the cart drove away. His final words, whispered with his last breath, were, "Napoleon is always right." The aftermath of the betrayal. The animals mourned Boxer, their grief heavy. But before they could question Napoleon's cruelty, Squealer arrived with another lie. "Comrades, do not be sad," he said. Our great leader Napoleon did everything he could for Boxer. He received the best medical treatment, but alas, he was too weak. Napoleon was by his side at the end, whispering words of comfort. Then, a shipment of whiskey arrived. Napoleon and the pigs drank late into the night, celebrating Boxer's glorious life. The animals, too afraid to question anything, forced themselves to believe the lie. The final transformation. As the months passed, Animal Farm's transformation was complete. The pigs walked on two legs. The commandments had all been erased, replaced with a single phrase. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Napoleon dressed in human clothes, smoked a pipe, and held feasts with the neighboring farmers. Animal Farm was no longer a farm run by animals for animals. It was a dictatorship, ruled by pigs, enforced by dogs, and justified with lies. And the dream of a better future was gone forever. Chapter 10. The Final Betrayal. Years passed. Many of the animals who had fought in the rebellion were gone. The younger generation, born after the revolution, knew no other life but Napoleon's rule. They accepted it without question. The farm was wealthier now, but the animals saw none of that wealth. The pigs lived in luxury while the rest worked harder than ever, barely surviving on meager rations. The once proud ideals of animalism had become nothing but a distant memory. The pigs become the humans. One evening, the animals gathered outside the farmhouse. Curious, they peered through the window and saw something shocking. Inside, Napoleon and the pigs were drinking and laughing with the human farmers. They played cards, toasted glasses of whiskey, and joked as if they were old friends. The animals were horrified. Hadn't they fought to rid themselves of humans? Hadn't the rebellion been about breaking free from their oppression? And then, the animals noticed something even more disturbing: the final scene. As they watched, they saw that the pigs had changed. They no longer looked like pigs at all. Their faces had become human-like, their movements identical to the men they once called enemies. And as Napoleon and the human farmers laughed and clinked their glasses together, the animals outside could no longer tell who was who. The pigs had become the very oppressors they had once overthrown. The revolution was not only dead, it had never truly existed at all. Final thoughts. Animal Farm is a warning about how power corrupts absolutely, and how revolutions, no matter how noble, can be twisted into something far worse than what they sought to replace. What began as a fight for freedom ended in a system even more oppressive than before. Napoleon did not free the animals. He enslaved them in a new way, with fear, manipulation, and lies. George Orwell's message is clear. Beware of those who claim to fight for justice but seek power instead. Beware of leaders who rewrite history. Beware of revolutions that replace one master with another. And most of all, beware of forgetting the past. Because when that happens, history has a way of repeating itself. Subscribe for more classic book summaries in just 40 minutes. Check out our other audiobooks and rediscover the most important stories ever written.